Welcome to the final roundtable, the 15th one in our series, Reinvent American Foreign Policy. I'm Peter Leighton. I'm the founder of Reinvent. I'll be moderating the conversation today. Now, we began the series in October with a timely conversation about the Iran nuclear weapons deal and how to shift American efforts towards more and more diplomacy. We did some fundamental rethinks after that on America's policy towards key countries or regions like Russia, China, the whole Middle East. We looked at how to find the right balance between individual privacy and national security in terms of surveillance and how to avoid building the next generation of nukes. But we also applied the national security lens to unconventional topics like climate change, pandemics, and global unemployment. And then we occasionally step back and look at the big picture topics like what is the foreign policy set of ideas of the millennial generation? Or how do we improve foreign affairs coverage given the collapse of the foreign correspondent system? Now, one theme that has emerged consistently throughout the series is a deep sense of worry about how dangerous the world is, and in whatever topic we're talking about. And there's a real concern that our current foreign policy or national security strategy is not up to solving the problem that we're discussing at that time. And often when my team, or all of the millennial generation, would debrief after each roundtable, one of them would frequently say, well, that was depressing. So for this final roundtable, we want to step back one more time and look at the big picture. Now, why are Americans so afraid? And also, but how dangerous is the world today, given, particularly compared to previous years? How dangerous is it? Is all this worry and concern warranted? What's the case that the world is much safer than many people think? And if so, how should we reappraise the size of our military and begin to reorient our foreign policy? Now, to help figure that out, we've got a terrific group of people, a couple of veterans from some past roundtables, and two new folks. And so the first I want to introduce is Jim Fallows, national correspondent at The Atlantic. We've wanted to get Jim on here for a long time, and we are so happy that Jim is with us today. So, Jim, give us a little bit of your background, what you bring to the table in your in terms of this topic.
Thanks, Peter. I'm really glad to have the chance to join you all here from rainy Washington. And the subject you're getting into is something that's been on my mind for a long time. I think I have these elements of bringing to the table. Number one, America's idea of itself has been on my mind since I was a history student in college long ago, and sort of studying the way in which fear of decline has been an American constant over the years. Second, 15 years ago or so, I spent a lot of my time journalistically, as I know some of my colleagues did here, on our current wars and the way in which the U.S. let itself be manipulated by fear of terrorism. Third, 10 years ago this week, I moved with my wife to China and spent almost 4 years there and trying to figure out what the U.S. should be afraid of in its dealings with the rest of the world. And then finally, for the last couple of years, my wife Deb and I have been traveling around the country trying to compare the despairing, fearful narrative that we hear at national level with the way the U.S. looks sort of city by city. So my leitmotif is the world is actually less dangerous, less threatening, less ominous than we think politically, and the question is how to bridge that gap and have people more realistically appreciate reality.
It's terrific to have you here. Thanks. We've also got Joe Cirincione, who's the president of the Ploughshares Fund, and he is a veteran of our very first roundtable, and now he's swinging back to the last one. Joe, give us a little bit of your background and where you're coming from on this topic.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here with this great panel, and it's a pleasure to close the circle here on these Reinvent forums. I've been working on national security issues here in Washington, D.C. for just about 35 years, including almost 10 years up on Capitol Hill as a staffer on the House Armed Services Committee, Government Operations Committee. I've been in the think tank world. I've been specializing on nuclear policy, so the dangers and threats from nuclear weapons, and now as president of Ploughshares Fund, I get to be a philanthropist and provide some of the resources to some of the smartest people with the best ideas on how to reduce these threats. And I got to say, I am an optimist. I'm not necessarily a born optimist. I think of myself as a realist. I'm looking at the global trends, and I honestly see the world getting better and better. I see the risks getting smaller and smaller. The risks that remain are substantial. We have some very serious risks, and if we don't do something about some of these risks, they could engulf us and bring us to planetary catastrophe. So this is true. It's just that the scale of these threats is actually smaller than it has been, I would say, at any time in human history. And our ability to reduce these threats even more is greater than it's ever been. We just need new leaders with the political courage to change the policies we have to help reduce these risks. I'm also confident that we're going to get those leaders and we're going to get those changes.
Well, great to have you. We'll definitely come back to that. Those themes covered back here. Next, we have Heather Hurlburt, who's the Director of New Models of Policy Change at New America. She also has been with us before, and we're great to have you back. But Heather, give us a little bit of your background in terms of this topic.
Great, thanks, and it's great to be back again in this in-depth format. I graduated from college the year the Berlin Wall fell, and so in some ways my whole adult life has been safer in foreign policy terms than I ever expected it to be. Also made my degree in Russian studies a little less useful than I had planned on it being. But 1989 was also the year of Tiananmen Square, so I think I've always had come to international issues with the idea that there were steps forward and steps back, and those were likely to take place at the same time. And after spending the first part of my career working overseas and then in think tanks in Congress and then in the Clinton administration, with the idea that what I was doing was just trying to apply good ideas to end conflict and decrease violence and make people's lives better, I sort of finally felt like I'd gotten run over by the truck of American politics one too many times, and if you can't beat them, join them. So my work is really looking at the intersection of politics and American foreign policy and understanding why we make the decisions we make, why we make the choices we make, why we perceive our options to be what they are, and how deeply bound up that is with who we are as a people and as a society. So, to me, the question we're talking today is about the intersection between what are the facts about the world we live in, what are the experiences and expectations that Americans are bringing when they encounter those facts, and how is that shaping both the present and possible future of our foreign policy.
Awesome. Great to have you here. And the fourth and final person we have here in our roundtable is Christopher Fettweis, who's the author of The Pathologies of Power, Fear, Honor, Glory, and Hubris in U.S. Foreign Policy. He also brings a lot more to the table. Do you want to give us a little bit of your background?
I teach international politics at Tulane University in New Orleans, and I apologize beforehand, I'm from New Jersey, so sometimes I speak too quickly. But I've been studying for a long time why we're so scared, why this country is so nervous. One thing that's consistent, and I tell my students throughout time, one belief that's consistent is we are living in very dangerous times. These are very perilous times for our country, for the world. We have no perspective. Just recently, Ray Odierno, former Army Chief of Staff, said this too, expressing Cold War nostalgia, said that it was so much easier to be a military leader during the Cold War. It's much more complicated now. This doesn't match the facts, but that doesn't really matter. For people, I don't know if my colleagues on the panel have had this experience. When I try to explain to people that we're living in relatively peaceful, safe times, people get mad. It's not that they disagree, they just don't believe you. This is our fear is not an intellectual position people come to. It's a belief that we're in dangerous times. So I've spent some time trying to figure out where that belief comes from and how to deal with it, because beliefs change much more slowly than ideas do. And we have a belief in this country that we are in tremendous danger, and that's consistent pretty much from the beginning of the Republic, certainly since the Cold War. So that's kind of what I've been studying and what I'm here to hopefully contribute a bit here and there about.
Wow. Well, I tell you what, this is such a great group to come together, and it looks like you're chomping at the bit to jump into it. So let's get into the conversation here, and maybe why don't we start with Jim to talk. You did an unbelievably important piece of work here in the cover story of the Atlantic, I think early part of the year here, about how what's going on in the country domestically is really misinterpreted and how many positive things are happening here. I'm just wondering if you would have written a sequel to that or built off that, how would you begin to think about what's going on in the world with potentially that same framework? And then we'll go around to others as well.
I think there is a parallel in consciousness that connects what I think all of us have been talking about, and the questions you've been asking, from our domestic sense of ourselves, especially during presidential election years, which it is as we speak, when always there's a need, structural need for the out party to say that things are really bad and getting worse, and the way we see the outside world. What we saw, what Deb and I saw domestically, was that city by city people would think, here in Fresno, here in Greenville, here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, things are okay. But what we hear about the rest of the world is that things are just going to hell. And a perhaps too simple, but I think valuable media construct I put on that is that back in the 1970s, as only one or two of us, maybe only me, can actually remember firsthand, crime in American cities was becoming a genuine disaster. That's when New York City was, just really in a bad shape in terms of street crime. In the 1980s and afterwards, crime went down, but fear of crime continued to go up. And so there was this, and partly it's the media and the way that cable news has made sort of a spectacle, any place, news every place, and there's no crime in your town you can hear about someplace else. But we have, I think the media, for structural and other reasons, has fed a habit in our politics of just kind of a sky is falling-ism. And that is just to sort of wrap this up, my sense of the American character is that when we really have to, and when the chips are down, people can actually be brave. For a month or so after 9/11, people were actually brave. When Franklin Roosevelt was up there, either at the beginning of the Depression or after Pearl Harbor, people could actually be brave. But our default mode the rest of the time is to be chickens, basically. And so our politics recently have been fanning the, you should be worried about everything, which is a human trait, an American trait, and so the cycle, as things objectively get better, fear gets worse, and it's like the kind of attitude towards crime in the 70s and 80s.
Interesting. Heather, you wanted to jump in on something?
Yeah, wanted to make a couple follow-on points to that. A colleague used to refer to the way foreign news is covered in the U.S. as the daily bus plunge. And when you look at coverage of events abroad, and this has gotten worse and worse over the last decade, as you noted in your roundtable on foreign press coverage, what makes news overseas? It is people having bad things happen, doing bad things to each other, violence, pollution, degradation. So if you are sitting at home someplace in the U.S. and you're not frequently exposed to the borders, if you're not traveling a lot, if you're not meeting people from other places, your diet of TV news and internet news about the world is almost entirely bad, sensational, or both. So that you can't overstate how the way Americans encounter the world is shaped by that. A second related point is how much more sensationalized our news coverage is than it is in the past, which I think and has been documented is really important to fear generation. Just that we are more able to know bad things, and we have them repeated to us over and over and over and over. So if you contrast those of us who grew up, I had duck and cover nuclear drills at my elementary school, but I wasn't seeing imagery on TV of nuclear attacks every single day. As my own kid is now, if I'm not careful, exposed to conversation about terrorism every single day. And so there really is a way that the media has shaped the culture of fear that's quite different. Frankly, we're just immersed in it in a way that's quite different from what previous generations encountered.
Joe, you had a thought about the press coverage as well, building on that?
I do. I think there's a number of very real reasons why Americans are so afraid, despite the fact that crime is down, violence is down. We have fewer wars now than we ever had in our history. There are fewer people dying from wars. So when you look at the objective data, things are getting better and better, but people are more and more afraid. And one of these is one Heather just pointed to, which is the media. And I was on the Jon Stewart show back in 2002, 2003, talking about dirty bombs. And Stewart asks me, It says, do you ever feel like the weatherman sometimes? About why I go on TV and I talk about these things. And so the weatherman? What? He says, well, you know, the weatherman is usually in the middle of the newscast, but when something terrible happens, he jumps up front to talk about the cyclone or the hurricane, and you know, that's his moment in the spotlight. Do you ever feel like that? And I realized then and there that's exactly right. It's not just that the media, you know, lives on danger, on threats, you know, millions could die back in a minute. It's that when they bring the experts on, like me, we get caught up in this too. So we are talking about the worst case scenarios. We're talking about the terrible things that could happen. And so Heather's point is exactly right. When you listen, when you're just tuning into the media, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC, they are very, very often talking about terrible, terrible things that happen somewhere in the world. And that this is now right in your living room. So your day-to-day experience is that terrible things are happening all the time, and it could happen to you tomorrow. So in my view, the media is a very big factor on why Americans are so afraid.
Well, I'll tell you what, before we keep going on the media piece, let's get some facts out here a little bit. And I know, Chris, you've done books on this, and you've been spending a lot of time kind of trying to nail this down. If you had to convince someone out there watching this here that, in fact, this is true happening, are there some numbers or stats or trends or something you could just point to kind of give a sense? Some
little things that people aren't maybe aware of, that there are currently no active conflicts in the Western Hemisphere. We were supposed to have a peace treaty in Colombia a couple of months ago. The final conflict in the Western Hemisphere is going to come to an end. It's been postponed, but that's pretty much over anyway. And civil war has been Colombia's national hobby pretty much since there's been a Colombia. But the entire Western Hemisphere now is at peace. I did a paper with a colleague of mine a couple years ago pointing out that the last 10 years have been the most peaceful in the history of the African continent. People think of Africa as, there's still ethnic conflict and hatred there. It's the most peaceful 10 years in history that we know of in Africa. Europe is completely at peace. But nobody cares. It's certainly true that as Joe said, fewer people are dying in battle, fewer civil wars, ethnic conflicts, but people think, the threats have just changed. So when I talk and I show the amount of people the numbers of people that are dying internationally, steadily dropping, people think, well, yeah, but now what about cyber conflict? Or what about global warming? People think the threats have just evolved. And it's not just the common people. And I think we give certainly the media plays a role, but our society is open to these ideas. It's not, Glenn Beck may be a paranoid lunatic, but he has an enormous audience. And people listen to it because it feeds in and confirms their belief that we're in tremendous danger. And there's a bunch of reasons for it, I think, and we can talk about that as this goes on. But one of them is we're comfortable in this society with good and evil. We're comfortable thinking that there's good and bad out there. We're a more religious society than others. And I think so there's a lot of other factors, including the media, that just helps us refuse to believe that relatively we're safe. Security's relative. We're never going to be safe. You're never going to be safe in your daily lives. Relatively speaking, though, we're tremendously safe. But nobody seems to believe me when I make these, or any of us when we make these kinds of arguments.
Well, let's build off that. And Heather, maybe you wanted to jump in here. There's the media piece, and maybe there's more nuances that we should think about that. But what is going on then? Why are people so afraid about this? I
want to start to dig a little bit into some of the causes that Chris references, because Jim, at the beginning you talked about the sort of the famous data about the disconnect between crime and fear of crime. And two academics at Johns Hopkins, Steve Tellis and David Dagan, have written a book looking at how Americans came around to the idea that we could reverse some of our draconian sentencing laws. And one of the things they come up with, which is really fascinating for them and really depressing for those of us who work in the international arena, is that you can look at the curve of fear of crime, and then 9/11 comes. And it sure looks like pretty much 1-for-1 fear of crime shifts to fear of terrorism. So there's something, it seems to me, so deep in the American psyche about fear of the other. And there's a case you can, there's a case you can make about this, that we are a country that is founded on people fleeing the other. We are a country that an awful lot of us got here through some means of violence, whether we were brought here as slaves against our will, whether we were fleeing other societies, whether we came here and fought in the military when we got here. But we are, if your genes ended up in America, you're somewhat more likely to have been at some past point exposed to violence. And it does seem that our society is hardwired. Although, I mean, again, you look at Europe right now, I don't think it's the case that we are hardwired to have distaste for others more than other societies do. But maybe we express it in fear. Precisely because we have a more open society in many ways.
Jim, you had some thoughts on what's going on there. What's going on?
Yes, we may be coming to one of the more discouraging parts of our conversation, which is supposed to be mainly upbeat, which is that I agree with the thrust of what Heather is saying, and I think all of us are going this direction. There is something in the history of this country and the background of the country, but at almost any point in American history, which again was my original academic background, you can find people being fearful. They're fleeing across the continent. They were either pushing out the native population or fearful of others chasing them. And through the 20th century, there's been, there was the great fear when I was a kid, that the great Red Scares, that there was a simultaneous fear of atomic devastation and fear of some of the subversive under the bed. And so I think that if you look in American history, you do find a very rich thread, rich in a perverse way, running through our politics. So I think that while there are universal things happening now about the change in communication media and ethnic resentments, and you see lots of countries in Europe and some in Asia that are reacting fearfully too, I think that our duty, all of us here are Americans in this discussion, the five of us talking now, is to think, what are the levers to address this tendency in the United States, which has there are many good aspects of the American character. This is a bad one. Finding ways in our role as media people, as scholars, as tech people, as people involved in politics to say, how can you avoid touching this nerve that is so easily inflamed in the American psyche?
Chris, you mentioned you want to talk about a structural problem also that adds to this, building off that?
Yeah, it's not just our society. If you look throughout history, most of the time, for whatever reason, the strongest country also fears differently than other countries. I think Robert Kagan is fond of saying now that in the Old West, the outlaw didn't shoot the saloon keeper, he shot the sheriff. The sheriff worries more, maybe because he thinks it's his job to worry more. The Romans they often feared the next barbarian over the hill, even though they were the safest society in the Mediterranean world. There's something about being on the top of the hill which makes us believe that others are trying to get where we are. Mm-hmm. And we fear more than for structural reasons, not just because of societal reasons.
Well, now one thing that has come up in other contexts, and let's go to Joe here in a second, but I think there has been thoughts that and I know you're talking, many of you here, the American character that goes way back decades and generations. But there has been a thought that since kind of the post-World War II kind of era and the Cold War and the building up of the military-industrial complex, and that there has been a kind of a structural reason in our politics to kind of keep perpetuating fear. I don't know, given that you're kind of in this nuclear space, is there something to that's a kind of perpetuating the system or flaming the fan here a little bit as another structural problem?
Well, there is something to that. It was very, very interesting what Chris has to say about when we're on top, we think that other people are coming at us. But we also, people have talked a lot about the nuclear security state, the rise of the nuclear security state in America after World War II. And what that means is you've built up institutions that are dependent on defense contracts, on building weapons, on maintaining a large standing army, maintaining an air force and a navy, a huge overseas presence. And a lot of that then is justified by analysis that there are bad people coming at us, and if we let down our guard, they're going to overwhelm us. They're going to take what we have. And I personally believe that through most of post-World War II history, those threats have been exaggerated. They, have been, there are threats, there are real bad guys out there, but the extent of the threat they present to us has constantly been exaggerated. One of the reasons is the institutional bias towards maintaining a very, very large military infrastructure in our country. But I think it's actually gotten worse recently, and not just because of Jon Stewart's media critique, not just because media makes money off of getting eyeballs to watch and eyeballs watch when there's a danger on the screen, but because of what's happened in the politics in our country. And in the last 8 years, it's worse than ever. I mean, I do believe that we now have one of the major parties which is completely dependent on spreading fear. On spreading fear that the current president of the United States can't be trusted to keep America safe, that he doesn't care about America, that he doesn't care about his American security, that he might not even be an American. And there's a ridiculous percentage of the American population, I think it's like 40%, that actually believe that Barack Obama is not a U.S. citizen, that he's a Muslim, or that that he's beholden to some secret conspiracy. And the Republican Party preys on this and depends on this, not just for turning out voters, not just for winning elections, but in undermining the legitimacy of the current president of the United States. And they are not going to let up on that. And now, with Donald Trump being the presumed candidate of the Republican Party, they're doubling down on fear. We've never had a presidential candidate whose campaign was so based on fear as we're experiencing now with the Trump campaign.
Yeah, now we can open up the spigot here on a little bit on politics. Heather, you want to jump in on a theme off this?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to your post-war question because I think there's some interesting evidence that suggests that actually what happens post-war is conditioned by the urbanization of the population and the change of the way we live, which actually happens pre-World War II. That we go from a time, and this is Peter Starnes, his American Fear is a wonderful book on this topic, that we go from a time where, if you grow up on a farm, fear is your friend. Fear is a key tool to avoid getting kicked by the cow or run over by the tractor or losing an arm in the combine. And as we move from a society where, our great-grandparents are very eager to have their kids be afraid of the things they should be afraid of, to a society where we're urbanized, everything's safe, and our parents start saying to us, or our grandparents, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I'm here. It's my job to keep you from experiencing fear. And then we get into this period of having existential threat and fear. When you're afraid of the bull goring you, the bull's not evil, but you nonetheless would do very well to be afraid of it. But we're now in a stage where fear and evil go together. You're afraid of the Soviet Union, you're afraid of the communists under the bed, not just because, they're a bull and they might gore you, but because they're inherently evil and they exist to do you harm. And then you can see how, applying that to 9/11, we get into a circumstance where these people made us feel afraid. They're not like us. They're from somewhere else. They're different in all these ways. We don't understand them. And they are operating totally outside the sphere of our norms. So anything we do back to them is okay because they're totally outside our sphere of norms. And that, Joe, I think that's what really opens the spigot for the quality of politics after 2008 being, bad in a different way. I hesitate to say this is worse than the McCarthy era because the McCarthy era was pretty bad and I'm lucky enough not to have lived through it. But we have this combination of that quality of the American character which thinks in black and white and good and bad, being constantly told that there are people who are inherently bad with brown skin and different religious beliefs, and they are out there to get us. And that, I think, really tees up the political environment that you described.
Well, so Joe introduced this idea of, kind of rolling into politics. So we've talked about media, we've talked about different structural things, history, character. the politics. Jim, you're a student of politics, and your commentary on the Trump ascendancy has been actually delightful to follow on Twitter, I must say. But on the other hand, so what do you make of this period of politics? I mean, what has emerged here? Is this just some crazy aberration, or is this worse than ever, or is this some kind of the fever will pass thing, or where are you kind of falling on the current politics?
So I think there's a very interesting way you can see the things for which Donald Trump himself, who as we speak is the presumptive nominee for the Republican Party, the things that he personally has introduced and the things that are structural. If you contrast his narratives of fear and decline with those of Ted Cruz, for example. I mean, Ted Cruz and to a lesser degree some of the other Republican candidates, they had their explicit narrative was you should really be afraid. I think that there was one famous moment when Ted Cruz greeted a little elementary school girl who asked him a question, Senator Cruz, am I going to be okay when I grow up? And he said, little girl, your world's on fire. And it was going on about how things look really bleak. And the other ones were giving versions of that. But there is something in the Trump pro-wrestling demeanor, which makes it different. I think he has changed the norms. I mean, for example, in almost every foreign policy, quote-unquote, speech or comment he gives, if people ask, is the world in trouble, say, oh, they're chopping off heads. And so they're burning people alive in cages. And so everything we've mentioned before about the way that the objective evil in the world, which is always there but is less than it's been during, modern history, the way it gets magnified, Trump himself is sort of a one-person magnifier on it. I think that we will look back on this period, assuming we have the free press and academic liberties to do so, as saying the way in which norms of discussion, including fear, were affected by Trump. They're things that he has normalized. And so there's some other illustrations I can give you another time or later in the discussion about way that fear affects other societies I've seen from England to Israel to China to Japan to Korea. But I think that right now, as we speak in 2016, we're all seeing the norms being changed and vulgarized in our politics in a way that's destructive, and we need to find some way to repair.
Well, Jim, before we shift to Chris on this, you have teed up something, and given that this is rethinking American foreign policy, let's bring the lens a little larger than the United States politics. You're all students of politics all over the place. How exceptional is the United States in this? From your point of view, and I know everyone has a different, we'll go to Chris next after that. You have some thoughts on that.
So I'll give first a sort of texture of society answer, and then a structure of structure of foreign policy answer. The texture of society, you can in any acting fearfully. I'm thinking one example long ago, one of the first novels of modern terrorism was The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad. It was the way in which a bomb in London could terrorize people. Then when I was living in Beijing, I guess this would have been probably 2008, or maybe it was 2011, where there was a terrible earthquake in Japan. And in Beijing then, about 6 hours after the earthquake, there was a panic through the streets of Beijing for this reason. People thought there was going to be these clouds of strontium-90 or something floating over from Japan, and there was a run through all the streets of Beijing to buy salt. People thought somehow that iodized salt was going to protect them, and you could look out and it looked like some Godzilla movie, to use a wrong nationality analogy of people running through the streets. So everybody is prone to this, but the reason that I think it looks odd for the United States is that from the outside, I think it's obvious how few things the U.S. has to worry about. Our wealth is enormous. Our physical location is so much better than China's or Poland's or Russia's or anybody else. We have immigration, etc. And to see these signs of fraidy catism and sort of cowardice, political cowardice in the U.S., I think it looks bad. It looks bad to us, and it looks even worse to others.
According to my foreign friends, that is, I can totally confirm that. But Chris, why don't you give us your sense of how does America compare to other countries in this fear factor, compared to the data, compared to the polling, or what other kind of academic resources you've been kind of checking this out on?
we generally fear much more than our close allies do. We feared more during the Cold War. The Europeans couldn't understand why we were so obsessed with Cuba in the Cold War. They couldn't understand why we were so obsessed with Saddam Hussein after the Cold War. They didn't see him as nearly the threat that we did. Generally speaking, we fear more, and it's not just our public. There are surveys of the Council on Foreign Relations members that think, and they've said consistently that lately, that they, CFR members, the elite sort of honor society of our foreign policy, that their membership thinks this is a more dangerous time than it was during the Cold War, which is crazy. I can forgive the person who doesn't pay much attention to international politics, as hard as that is for me to believe. But so a lot of people don't, and they think the world is very dangerous. That makes sense. They see things on TV. They know about terrorists. They hear Donald Trump. But I can't forgive Martin Dempsey, who the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said this is the most dangerous period of his life. And I can't forgive the neoconservatives, who are all true believers. I don't think they're manipulating the data, or they're trying to change in directions they don't believe. They believe that the world is a much more dangerous place, and without U.S. intervention everywhere, everything's going to go to hell even more. So I'm puzzled more by the people who should know better who don't, than the people who don't, for whom politics is every 4 years they start to become interested a little bit. It's more puzzling to me the experts who still refuse to wrap their minds around the idea that they're relatively safe, and so is this country. And I think that puzzles a lot of our allies too. They can't understand why we worry so much.
Well, do you think it's a cynical play, or it's a kind of or do you really think in their heart of hearts they are fearful as well as the kind of average Trump supporter guy?
Yeah, I think if we had some neocons on this panel, we'd have true believers say, "Hey, look, don't forget about the rise of China, and it's this generations-long war against radical Islam." I think the people I've met who are on the other side really believe that we are in tremendous danger. And unfortunately, we've had people really believing we're in tremendous danger for as long as we've had the United States, especially since World War II. We've had people who just cannot be convinced that we're a relatively safe country. And I think that's because it's, like I said, it's not really an idea. It's a belief. It's connected to their emotions more than their intellect.
Joe, you brought up the kind of other side and unprecedented kind of fear-mongering of one of the parties, let's say, and the neocons. Do you see it as a kind of a cynical thing, or do you see it as a kind of a true believer thing that's even infecting the intellectual elite of essentially, at the highest levels, not just the Trump supporter?
I think at its core, it's a genuine belief that the U.S. hegemony over the world is threatened, and that the U.S. hegemony is a good thing. And this is, who else do you want dominating the world? Do you want China to dominate the world? Do you want France to dominate the world? The U.S. hegemony is a good thing. We have to preserve it, and it's under siege. And it's under siege, and I think Chris was referencing this, primarily by the rising power. Who's the rising power? China. China is rising. So Paul Wolfowitz in 1999, for example, writes a wonderful essay called Fin de siècle all over again. He's talking about how people at the transition from the 19th to the 20th century also thought that war was a thing of the past, that new technologies were spreading, that were bringing countries closer together, that everybody was more economically independent, and we now had mechanisms such as the Hague Peace Conference for working out international conflicts. And what happens, he says, 2 of the bloodiest wars in in human history, and they were caused by who? By the rising powers, in this case Germany and Japan. The obvious example for today, this was at the beginning of the 21st century, he said, was China. China's rising, and they are naturally going to threaten us. And so in their belief, a war between China and the United States is inevitable. It is coming, and the Middle East is the current battleground for that, and we have to prevail in the Middle East, secure American interests there for a generation or more in order to get ready for the really serious war, which is going to be that between the U.S. and China. I believe that they believe that. But on top of that, you get this using fear and using threat for political purposes to defeat Democrats, to constantly portray Democrats as weak on national security, can't be trusted, America's under siege, we're the only ones who can protect you, we have to increase the military budget, and now with Donald Trump, we literally have to build walls. that we literally have to protect our country with physical barriers to protect ourselves, not just from the Chinese overseas, but from the Mexicans on our southern border. And interestingly enough, this is actually causing a split in the Republican Party because the neocons don't think the Mexicans are a threat, and they're upset that Donald Trump is weakening the party at exactly the time they see a chance to reclaim power and concentrate on the real threat. So it's a mixture of both belief and political opportunism.
Got it. Hey, since we have a bona fide China expert here, Jim, given your reality check on China there, what would you say about that? And then I want to go to Heather.
Yeah, so just to talk for just a minute about this, I think that it's striking that people like Paul Wolfowitz and others are the ones who are most alarmed about the China menace, because as far as I can tell, their lives are unsullied by any actual contact with China. I think that almost one of the things I was trying to do in my writing from China over the years is to, and this is related to our theme, is to encourage Americans to do something that goes against our modern nature, which is to take a country seriously without being afraid of it. And China you have to take seriously because it affects everything else we do, in the good side, environmentalism, also on the bad side, environmentalism, and all the rest. The reason not to be afraid of it is that anybody with experience there knows that whatever problems the U.S. has, China has to the nth degree. I did a informal survey of some of my foreign friends in Beijing before we left a couple of years ago, asking if anybody was afraid of China. And nobody was. They were afraid for China. And as a side note, China is becoming more troublesome in the last year or two under Xi Jinping. And I think the U.S. needs a somewhat different approach in dealing with just China becoming more difficult internally and externally. But in terms of being afraid of China, that is, you won't find many people who actually know the place who come down on that side.
Heather, you had some other insights into other kind of countries and nationalities and the fear factor?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, this question of how does a society express and process these sort of same tensions that in the U.S. seem to come out as fear. And I keep hoping we can push Jim to talk a little bit about what that's like in China, which is, undergoing these incredible transitions and dislocations, and by any rights, those people should be some of the most anxious people on earth, given how quickly their society is changing and how much of their society is or the organizational forms of their society are under threat one way or another. So I, thought of two places that we think of as being very unfearful societies in different ways that nonetheless have done some of the same sort of crazy, dumb policy things recently. And one of them actually is Denmark, right? Because where you think of Denmark as this incredibly, sort of social democracy, benefits for everyone, incredibly open and tolerant, wonderful society. So Denmark passed a law a few months ago. If you come to Denmark as a refugee, you must surrender everything of value that you bring with you, including your jewelry, so that the country can pay for your upkeep as a refugee, which is, one of the most un-Nordic things, at odds with the stereotype of Denmark that we've heard in the presidential campaign up to now, imaginable. And so, think, how do we, and yet that's not a country where people report being afraid. It's not a country where people lock their doors. It's not a country where people keep guns and accidentally on purpose shoot their neighbors. So how do we understand the feelings that are driving Danes to do that, and yet aren't the same kind of fear that we're talking about here? The other example that I think is fascinating is Israel. Because when you get into discussions of fraidy cat Americans, as I think you said earlier, the Israelis are always held up as, oh, this is the society that goes out and picks up the pieces, literally pieces of human beings after a bombing, and the cafes open right back up the same day, and the buses keep running, and the plucky little Israelis just keep doing what they're doing. And, Israeli society at this point has actually taken this to kind of a surreal extreme, so that you go to Tel Aviv and people are on the beaches and in cafes, and you would never ever get a sense that this is a country that feels it's engaged in an existential struggle. At the same time, this is a society that's having a truly frightening run of violent knife attacks, and its prime minister has never mentioned it, has never spoken in public about there being these repeated stabbings of Israeli citizens by Palestinians in over the last, 6-8 months. And in most of our societies, a leader couldn't get away with that. A governor would lose his job. So the idea that the famous Israeli lack of fear has kind of led to this just totally warped and weird political culture is I think, we may be the only ones that fear the way we do, but we're not the only society that has a strange and unhealthy relationship with anxiety. Let's just put it that way.
Well, okay, so let me shift the topic a little bit here, because this is not only about the fear and parsing the fear here, but it's also trying to wrap up the series and look ahead at kind of the kind of grand strategy foreign policy a little bit here. So let's think this through and think, if you could just start with a blank slate and really thought about the next coming decades, maybe to the mid-century, and like grand strategy kind of thinking, what should Americans genuinely be afraid of? And what should we be kind of recalibrating our national security thinking and our foreign policy thinking around? I'd be interested to say, despite all the optimism here and things and the overblown kind of perceptions of our current politics, let's just kind of step back for a minute and think, what is worth worrying about? And Joe, why don't we start with you, because I think when people think about nukes, that is something different than any other period of American history, and that is an existential threat in some ways. And anyhow, there's a sense there. We can tell us a little bit about that, and let's have others. I'd like to hear from others of other topics as well.
There are lots of things to be worried about in this world, in our daily lives, in our cities, in our towns, and in the Middle East. But of all the challenges we face, there are only two that threaten destruction on a planetary scale, and that's climate change and nuclear weapons. And both of these are caused by machines that we invented, but both of these can be prevented, reduced, and eventually even eliminated if we have the right policies. And nuclear weapons are the perfect case study of this. During the Ronald Reagan era, during the height of the Cold War, when Heather was going into college, we had about 66, almost 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. Since that point, we've come way down to about 15,000. That's still 15,000 too many nuclear weapons, but we've made enormous progress in cutting those arsenals. We've made enormous progress in restricting the number of countries that have nuclear weapons. People think that lots of countries have nuclear weapons, that more and more countries are getting nuclear weapons all the time. That just isn't true. It's not true. Back in the 1960s, there were about 23 countries that we worried about who either had weapons or had research programs to build weapons. We only have 9 countries in the world that have nuclear weapons. We're way down. In fact, more countries have given up nuclear weapons in the last 30 years than have tried to get them. And Obama has just made history by making a deal with Iran that effectively ends the nuclear threat from that country, at least for two decades, reducing their capacity to even build nuclear weapons. He's the first president in 24 years to actually not have a country go nuclear on his watch. Bill Clinton had India and Pakistan. George W. Bush had North Korea. Obama's actually scratched a nuclear country off the list. We only have North Korea left to worry about. So it shows you that with the right policies, with the right plans, and Republicans and Democrats have done this, liberals and conservatives, you can actually reduce one of the threats. What you have to worry about now is one of these 15,000 nuclear weapons going off, either by miscalculation or misunderstanding, or a terrorist group stealing one of these weapons or the material to build one, or a new state still getting them. But with the right policies, you can steadily reduce these threats and shrink them in scale. So that's one of the reasons I'm optimistic. I've seen these policies work. I've seen human ability to reduce this threat that we invented in the first place.
Terrific to hear that. Yeah, Chris, give us your kind of thoughts on a short list or one or two things that you think really are the important things to focus on, to be worried about, genuinely worried about.
I think that's a great question, and I wonder just right away, do we have to worry? I mean, do we have to come up with something to worry about? I mean, I actually worry more about our worry, because scared actors do stupid things. If we get scared of fundamentalists, next thing you know, we attack Iraq. Or, and I maybe disagree slightly with Joe, that if we get scared of Iranian nuclear weapons, we may attack Iran. Even thank God for the New Deal, but I am not convinced that there's too much to worry about. And I think there's an assumption that, well, okay, if we solve the Cold War problem and maybe we're overblowing the Islamic fundamentalist problem, then what else is there we should worry about? As if there's a constant fear factor that we have to fill. It would be. There's other domestic challenges. The United States has enormous problems in various ways, but nothing existential. And former President Bush used to love to say that Islamic fundamentalism constitutes an existential threat to the United States, which is preposterous. They can't. It's not going to harm our existence. There's no existential threats out there, and you have to kind of think about science fiction, gamma ray blasts or comets coming at us to really think of existential threats. We should be happier. This is good news. We should be a bit more happy, more optimistic about the future. But as a country, all polls show we're much more pessimistic than we were even 10, 15 years ago. So I'm not sure we have anything to worry about on an enormous scale. We have very few top-level threats, some little secondary threats. Venezuela might implode. Okay, so there's always problems. But I don't know if there's something that we really need to be worrying about and worrying my children about anymore. That should make us happy. It doesn't, but it should.
That's terrific. We'll get to the implications of that, honestly, a little bit later in the conversation here. Jim, how about you? What would you say? I mean, should we just stand down everything, or what should we be worrying about in the next 30 years here?
So I think Chris very usefully frames the question of what do we have to worry about. If worry we're defining as something different from being aware of unfavorable circumstances we need to address, which is the case for individuals and countries and the world, as opposed to worry being a sort of a destructive fear that makes you do things you might not rationally want to do in the longer run. And I think that by that standard, again, we have challenges but not real threats, by which I mean the following. I'll try to see it very carefully. First, I think the main U.S. assumption for the next generation should be a position of confidence. The United States is better positioned than any other major nation on Earth, and it's not even close. I mean, the new issue of The Atlantic has a very interesting article by Howard French pointing out that right now there's roughly 4 times as many people in China as there are in the U.S. In about 20 or 25 years, it's going to be about a 2-to-1 ratio because the American population is young and growing with immigration. The Chinese is old and shrinking because of the one-child policy. And in many other ways than that, I think the U.S. is very well positioned if it doesn't limit and harm itself through fearful actions. What are then the challenges to deal with, in my view? I think climate, they're mainly ones which are challenges of the commons, in my sense. Climate is an obvious one. Managing nuclear weapons, as Joe was saying, is an important one. And then I would put all the rest that come from a big, disorderly world going through its second Gilded Age, whether it's spread of disease, whether it's refugees, which are a genuine problem in Europe right now, and for the world as a whole. So all these things about 7 or 8 billion people being connected in a way they never have before, traveling in a way they never have before, and having the challenges of the commons in managing 7 or 8 billion people where we are the strongest actor by far. So we should act confident in our manifest strength and leverage, aware of these problems, and applying, and aware too that the main thing which undercuts our interest is panicky, selfish, cowardly seeming, unthought through, fearful actions.
Very, very interesting. Heather, your thoughts on this?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I agree with everything Jim said about how we should act and how we should face the world. But at the same time, I disagree with Chris. I do think some of the challenges that we face are existential. And so, no, destructive worrying is never a good idea. And as the mother of an 11-year-old, I say that to myself regularly. But at the same time, I do think some of these threats are existential. Climate change is an existential concern for the type of planetary life and ecosystem that we're used to. Nuclear weapons are an existential concern for the reasons that Joe laid out. We also, I think, face an existential threat which may overlap with what Jim called our second Gilded Age, but what I would call the challenge of finding ways to have effective representative government both at the local, national, and global level in an era of highly connected inability to wall ourselves off by cultural difference, basically. So we're stuck. And this goes back to politics again, because we are stuck with this multicultural world, and this is kind of the dirty little secret that the Trump supporters and the people who vote for Marine Le Pen in France and who vote for the far-right parties in Hungary and who brought a far-right party into government in Poland. And, we could talk about parties at the far-right in Asia as well. But there's no going back. I mean, there is no wall. So we are going to have to figure, and, this experiment of trying to run a democracy with this many nationalities, of trying to run minimal social welfare systems. I mean, this is why I mentioned the Danes and the refugees, because if you get to a point that you see the other as somewhat less than human, and that their wedding ring is worth less to them than your wedding ring is worth to you, then your social solidarity, as they like to say in Europe, is not going to work very well. So I really view that as an existential threat to the American Constitution, to our democracy, to our way of life, and as a threat that, frankly, in its manifestations beyond our shores, is going to express itself in violence, and in sometimes in extremist violence, sometimes in non-state actor violence, sometimes in state-on-state violence. And I'll just mention one more thing, which is to say that I disagree strongly with the neoconservatives on how we should prepare ourselves and how we should look at the rise of near peers and of growing powers. But it is also true that through human history, the states that have sparked destructive wars are states that are in exactly the kind of turbulent change and sort of weakness and strength all mixed together that Jim described China as being. I mean, think of Russia in 1915, 1914, for example. Think of Germany before World War I, where you have in the state this: are we getting stronger? Are we getting weaker? And so it doesn't make sense to me to say, oh, because state X is a mess, it doesn't pose a threat to the international system. We know that that's exactly when states pose a threat to the international system. Now, that doesn't mean we should be trying to contain China, or that we need to build a 300-ship blue water navy. But I also think it's not wise. History doesn't suggest that this is a good time to write off those states' ability to cause us significant and possibly existential difficulties.
I know, Joe, you want to build on that, but it is interesting. It's possible we might be shifting into some kind of different phase of history that a lot of the lessons of history might not be as applicable going forward in this century. But anyhow, Joe, you had some thoughts on that.
And just very quickly picking up on Heather and Jim's points. By the way, I love this conversation. This was a terrific discussion what happened. You often hear people saying, and on both sides of the political divide, that the world is a mess. The world is not a mess. It's just messy. We have these problems. We have serious a collapse of the existing order in the Middle East. This is true. This is an historic phenomenon that we're going to have to live with for a decade or two as we watch the old structure that the French and the British and then the Americans created now come apart, and people struggle to find their national identities. This is a mess in the Middle East, but the world itself is doing pretty darn good, and it's not just Steven Pinker in his book that talks about this. We do not have major powers in conflict. We are not going. We have small wars. We do not have major wars. Europe, the bloodiest continent in human history, has been at peace for over 70 years now, with a couple of tragic exceptions to that peace. This is going well. President Obama just gave a wonderful commencement speech at Rutgers over the weekend where he talks about this, where he talks about people referring to the good old days, where he says, guess what, they weren't that good. especially for a lot of people, especially for minorities and for women. And the world is actually getting better. And he cites some of the statistics that Chris cites. So when we see these problems, when we see these challenges, as Jim calls them, we have to understand that these are manageable. With the exception of climate change and nuclear weapons, we do not have an existential threat. We do not have anything else that threatens our existence as a nation. We can deal with these, and in fact, we and our allies are better positioned to deal with these challenges than we ever have been before in our history.
Jim, you want to follow on that?
Yes, and just to connect what Joe was saying just then, and with Heather's point, I think that I do agree with Joe that the world is messy but not a mess, and also that I think it's important that the containedness of great power conflicts right now is really important to recognize. Chris has talked about that too. That by any historical standard, the U.S. and China should be at each other's throats right now in a way that they are not. And there's been this enormous change in world economic power and political consciousness and all the rest. And I think partly it's to the credit of, believe it or not, regimes on both sides, both Chinese and the American side, from the time of Nixon through Obama, the time of Mao through Xi Jinping, to manage this historical transformation as well as they have. And I think it's also worth noting that while, as I was saying earlier, China is becoming more difficult now, and everybody who deals with it is aware of that, and the discussion is whether or not the Xi Jinping era is a sort of up and down in the historical fluctuation or a really new and more difficult normal for China. But I don't think many people are seriously saying this is a World War I type of circumstance, that recognize the challenges in the various China seas, and we recognize all the other things that are going on, but the difference between this and the build-up to World War I, I think, is profound and valuable. So this is just to sort of reinforce the point that compared to what might have happened, more things are going well than you might think.
Well, is it safe to say that we may be in some kind of phase shift at some level? I mean, a lot of what, we're making comparisons to, like, the rise of the powers in the early 20th century or different kind of eras. Is it possible that we're so interconnected now as a global, economy, as a global kind of technological entity, flows and everything going on, that it's just we are genuinely entering some new system in which we do have to throttle back militarily, but we still have to throttle up engagement with the rest of the world? I'm just trying to are we at some point where we need to almost kind of fundamentally rethink American foreign policy and national security? And I'll say to Chris, you were the first one who said, why do we have to worry about anything? I mean, that would be a sign of a clearly a phase shift in how we think about national security. Did you have anything to add to that that you want to do? And I'd love to hear from other folks about what do we start to do to adjust to this new reality, given this kind of the thoughts of the lowered expectations now on threats and also the new opportunities opening up. Chris, you there? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's a good point, Peter. I think that the rules that govern warfare, what it's worth fighting for and what's not, evolve over time. And we may have evolved to a new place now that raises the bar for what is worth fighting for most of the big countries, especially around the world. It doesn't mean it can't get worse. It doesn't mean that in 50 years from now we could go back to an older set of rules. But you really have to move into a bit of science fiction to come up with a reason for the United States or China, for instance, to think it would be in their interest to go fight today. And it's not 1914, when all the great countries of Europe were eager to get into war. I think Churchill wrote that everyone everywhere was willing to dare. And nobody's willing to dare today. It may be that it's a temporary evolution in how we think about the rules for what's acceptable to fight. But when there's a lot of institutional, what we were talking about earlier, institutional interest in a way of making China seem like it's tougher than it is. I used to teach at the Naval War College, and if you take away China and the threat of a possible Chinese Blue Water Navy, there's really no point in having a U.S. Navy because there's no other navies out there. And so there is an institutional bias in trying to make China into a bigger threat than it is, largely from our men and women in blue who, right now, it used to say the old days that the British kept a two-navy standard. They wanted to be bigger than the next two navies combined. Today, the United States has about a 17 Navy standard. We're more capable than the next 16 or 17 navies combined. So there are institutional barriers to recognizing when the rules of international politics evolve. But it's possible. Maybe it's too optimistic. It's, however, possible to think that a generation or two from now, we'll look back on warfare, especially big warfare, the way we look back on slavery now, as a bizarre human institution that was totally liberal and totally insane, and that our forebears thought was a good idea. Maybe not. Warfare is never going to totally go away, but it's possible to think we may be moving in that direction.
Jim, let's go to you next on this. I mean, and again, part of Reinvent is to really fundamentally rethink this stuff and not try to let go of the legacy thinking and start thinking, is there a juncture here where we should just really be fundamentally rethinking this? And I know you've talked a little bit, I mean, for a long time we've thought of the U.S. as kind of the global cops. I mean, are they maybe evolving to the global coordinators, or are they is there a global governance systems that might evolve, or are there we were talking a little bit before about the breakdown of our politics. I mean, is there something that we're shifting to that's a different kind of world that's not that far off on the horizon, maybe decades or so?
On the one hand, none of us ever wants to underestimate or rule out the possibility of things going wrong in some way we don't foresee. I say this as somebody who confidently predicted last summer that Donald Trump would not get the nomination. So, things can happen that you don't foresee. On the other hand, it's worth recognizing how many things just within the lifetime of some older people still around, like me, have changed. For example, that the idea that France and Germany would be essentially partners as opposed to at each other's throats militarily. The idea that England and Germany and France would not be fighting these periodic wars every 20 or 30 years. The idea that Japan, which my parents thought of this bloodthirsty nation that was taking over half of Asia, would be essentially a pacifist society where their main memory of World War II is the atomic bomb, and therefore they think themselves as the vessels of anti-nuclear warnings. The idea that China would be an outlier in the world stage as being a non-democracy. It's one of the few that is left, but also that for all the problems we have with it, we're not seriously talking about it invading somebody else or going to war. So I think that it's worth recognizing that without being Pollyannas, maybe the utility and the resort to war is just different from what it's been in previous parts of our society, and so of our human history. And so because nuclear weapons and other reasons, and so we can start thinking our national security really involves the international mesh of architecture and buffers to contain the things that really are threats to the commons, to recognize, to try to contain also the inevitable localized conflicts that will continue, but try to buffer their effects from spreading. So yes, I would hope that our political rhetoric offers almost no hope whatsoever of this new era. If you listen to the way that all the presidential candidates and all sides are talking about it, but with the force of new people coming into government, the media, and academia, I think the ground will be prepared for the kind of change you're talking about.
Joe, how about your thoughts? I mean, a world where you're not as worried about even regional conflicts, certainly not great power conflicts, you think radically different about the military, and when you are worried about nuclear proliferation, you think differently about different kind of aspects of foreign policy. Talk to us about some big swings you'd start to point towards that we might start to contemplate.
Yeah, there's a natural and almost understandable lag between our national security apparatus and the world realities. I am going to date myself here, but when Heather was graduating college, I was actually, and the Berlin Wall came down, I was actually in Berlin the week the wall came down. I was on a tour of NATO facilities for the House Armed Services Committee, and I saw the wall coming down. I saw the people tearing down the wall. It didn't fall by itself. People made that change. The people of Eastern Europe that had been rebelling against these oppressive governments that had dominated them for generations. So you could see the change happening. But even while that was happening, we were getting briefings from our NATO commanders about how East German tanks were going to come through the Fulda Gap. They couldn't quite adjust quick enough, and it actually took us years to recognize the changes that were happening. You know, Robert Gates is famous for, when he was at the CIA, for saying that Mikhail Gorbachev was a fraud, that it was all a hoax. We now know that this was all true, but it took our national security apparatus years to adjust. And I think we may be seeing the beginning of our apparatus adjust from this period of war in the Middle East, where we're seen as essential that we stay, that we solve the war, we win the war in Iraq, we win the war in Afghanistan. You see the American public wanting to pull back. Barack Obama is clearly an example of that. And even the two major party candidates, neither one of them, who are the presumptive nominees, I guess you'd say Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, but let's count Bernie Sanders, none of them actually want to recommit to the Middle East. They all want to have this pullback, and that means we may have a chance in the next administration to rebalance the tools of American national security, of using all the tools at our disposal, not just the military, which is still spending above Cold War levels, over $600 billion a year, but let's look at our economic power. We're still the world's leading economy. Our cultural power, we dominate the world culture. Look, our diplomacy, our alliance systems. You know, if we, and all of this comes essentially from our economic strength. If we rebalance a bit, readjust a bit, pull back on our military, reinvest in some of the things we have to do, I really do think that America could continue to play a leadership role through this century, and it really could be what the neocons want, an American century, just not in the military way they want, but more in the economic, cultural, and diplomatic ways that America has long pioneered.
Terrific. Heather, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so let me try to frame this a little differently. What if the most important revolution we've had globally in the last 50 years is the communication, not even so much the facts of communication and information technology, but the expectations that they've brought along with them? That if citizens everywhere, not just in the US, expect their standards of living to go up, are able to compare themselves to others in their own country and in other countries, and expect their standards to go up by that, expect to have the consumer goods that they see people in other places having, and particularly in the West, expect their government, their society writ large, to provide the same kind of consumer experience that, let's say, Apple does or that Google does. That revolution of expectations creates enormous challenges, and though you might not think it, it creates them in the security realm also, because when you see, as I think you do, all over the developed and developing worlds in different ways, anger and frustration, you know, whether it's lower middle class white males in America angry that, you know, they don't have the hopes for their children that their parents had for them and that they believed was their birthright, you know, or whether you see it in Uganda and the change and disappearance of traditional societies, and where something like gay rights is perceived as an oppressive Western move to cut away traditional authorities. And you get, you know, as we've discussed, all these various kinds of right-wing movements in response, and in some places you get various kinds of violent movements in response. You know, one can understand both ISIS and Al-Qaeda as responses to a couple of generations of humiliation and failed promises to people in the Middle East. And, you know, not the majority, but a small minority took up violence and justified violence in this rhetoric and stories of a past time. So if dealing with those expectations is sort of our great global challenge, then, you know, on the one hand, having a military that's geared up to, you know, fight land wars in Asia is a really bad idea. But the big test for us is, do we know other ways to deal with those expectations? And frankly, right now, it's not really clear we know how to deal with them in our own society.
And then I think, and this is where I would argue this change actually is taking place. It's quite far along, but it may not be far along in ways that progressives like. And this is part of, you know, the great irony of what Barack Obama's legacy is going to be. If you can't figure out how to create policies that have distributive effect, if you can't figure out how to empower people, if you can't figure out how to make government work as well as Apple, just because it's really damn hard, we can't make this government work as well as Apple, and we have so many resources. So then you are going to continue to end up with small scale but vicious conflict and violence, and if your governments are weak because you can't figure out how to solve these underlying problems, they're going to be more vulnerable to smaller amounts of violence. And that, I think, is where we are, and that's why you've seen this administration, which came into office very much wanting to pivot away from the use of force as our primary tool in national security, why you've seen this administration double down on drones and targeted killings and special forces and having, you know, many small-scale military operations, because we have this big, beautiful military hammer, and we don't know in our own society how to get at the root causes that would prevent us from being challenged to offer more military responses down the road.
I hear you. Now, so, okay, it's come up here. Now we're melding back into current politics. We're also getting to the point here where we have to start looking towards the end. We've got an election. We talked about the crazy way politics has kind of emerged here. We've talked about this kind of idyllic, almost, future that we could be moving for. If you had to give some just bold but still realistic advice to the current candidates, let's just say, Trump being a special case, I don't know what you'd advise him, but basically, what would you say? I mean, is there some kind of bold, but still in the context of our politics, kind of shift that would be a step in the right direction that would really help things out, knocking out significantly dropping military spending, or some kind of shift? I'm just curious from your thoughts, how would we start this ball rolling in a different direction, given the kind of general sense that the world is less dangerous than everyone else perceives? Jim, why don't you start? Can you give us any thoughts? You've been and you've all been in politics to some extent, so I'd love to hear, like, how do we move on this now?
So first, one point about challenge and then about response. I think that's something that's gone through a lot of our discussions is, for the United States in particular, I think lots of things are going well, but it's a difficult time in national politics. And our national politics are where our country intersects with the rest of the world most directly, although we have lots of other ways. So that's a challenge. And there are also the issues of structure for international governance. I'm not going to say government, but governance on things from disease to climate to nuclear weapons and all the rest. And I think we've seen over the last 60 years people trying to find ways to put the tendrils of those together. I think for the part of this, it's within American control, which is our own national bearing as we deal with the rest of the world and present ourselves. I would imagine if I could assume away the entire Trump campaign right now and imagine one that would do the tone we're looking for, I would mainly try to project confidence, hope, a sense that the wind is at humanity's back in many ways, except when it comes, and the ways in which it's at our back can help us deal with things which are genuine challenges. You know, climate is a huge challenge in my view, and dealing with nuclear weapons and all the other aspects of messy world we dealt with. So I would find some way to draw on the legacies, rhetorical, emotional, psychological, and political, of Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt and Dwight D. Eisenhower and John Kennedy, of saying it's a good time coming for the United States, for the world, for most people in the world, and for those most people in the world as they try collectively to find ways to deal with the things that are bad for billions of people in the world and that threaten all of us. So I would go into these upbeat, chipper, confident, forward-looking, technologically friendly, non-fearful elements of the American heritage, draw on all of those and say, this is how we're ready for the next era in American achievement and world achievement.
And just one thing to finish that off, Jim, and then we're going to go Joe here. Would you say full speed ahead with American engagement with the rest of the world, or would you say pull back to some extent? I know maybe militarily, but yeah, there is a big discussion now from Bernie, from Trump, from a bunch of folks about how much do we out and how much do we back, how much we take.
Well, it's a sign of the poverty of our political discourse that engagement has come to mean sending the military. Whereas, in fact, the United States is the best equipped country right now to be engaged in the broadest sense of all the rest of the world, partly because we include the world inside of us. So, the main thing I've learned by spending, a decade plus of my life, 15 years outside the United States, is how much our ability to absorb talent from around the world is our distinctive advantage. And so I think engagement culturally, economically, in our educational institutions, in our soft power and all the rest, yes, that engagement should proceed faster than ever. Military commitment, I would try to curtail where possible.
Terrific. Chris, if you had to kind of give your advice, what would you be pushing there? Realistic, but still bold.
It's tough. It's tough because, as I said, we're not dealing with ideas here. We're dealing with beliefs in the population. President Obama says a lot of the right things. He's aware that conflict is going down. He's aware that we're relatively safe and that credibility is overblown. But when he says it, people don't believe him and they tend to react angrily. So it's very difficult. I think the next president should realize, if he or she wanted to move us in the right direction, that we're dealing with deep-seated beliefs people have. But you can change things, especially on the margins. One little thing can be done. The tone of the Department of Homeland Security has always been wrong. And the quick metaphor I always use is, if you're in an airplane and the wing is on fire, the flight attendant is going to say, hey, oh, that's fine, the wing's on fire, so have a seat, would you like some peanuts? Instead, our Homeland Security Department says, look, there's a small chance that the wing might explode into flames during the flight, enjoy your flight. That people out of it. We should have a different kind of approach to the threats that we have. The government should be a bit reassuring and realistic in its tone. Over time, beliefs can change if the tone from the top, however, leads us in that direction. Whether or not it's going to happen with President Trump, we're one ISIS attack away from President Trump. Sleep tight, everybody. Whether President Trump can push in that direction, I'm not too sure. But that's what could happen.
Thanks. Joe, your thoughts on your advice?
I don't think I can follow Chris. I think we should just drop the mic. that was a great analogy, but I'll be real quick. There's two big changes the next president could make, and one is, frankly, in the Middle East. I think a lot of our allies are hoping they can sucker the next president of the United States back into a major military engagement in the Middle East. And I think whoever the next president is can make it crystal clear that we're not going to do that. We're not going to commit the classic blunder of engaging in a land war in Asia. That we are going to be engaged, just as Jim said, but that does not mean military, and we're serious about pulling our troops out of Afghanistan and Iraq, but backing our allies, having a modest force there. And that's number one. I think if you do that, you can really start changing the dynamic of the Middle East and get some serious negotiations to end some of the current civil wars in that region. Number two, it's on nuclear. We are in the crazy position of about to spend $1 trillion to rebuild the Cold War nuclear arsenal. Every plane, every bomber, every sub, every warhead, and put this Cold War system in place for almost the rest of this century. Why? Why are we going to do that? The president can make a break with that, to close a spigot, not shut everything down, but a bunch of it down, save hundreds of billions of dollars that you could shift either to domestic needs or to other conventional military needs, some of the things we actually use. And one of the ways you do that is you decouple American nuclear posture from the Russians. Stop giving the Russians a veto on what we have. Stop trying to have parity. If the Russians have this much, we have to have this much. No, you don't. You can have this much, and it's perfectly fine. That is plenty to deter any country from attacking us. You could decide that the time for parity is over. We can make cuts. We can save the money. We can reinvest in the things we really need, not the false illusion of security nuclear weapons give us.
Got you. Heather, are you there?
Yes. Great.
We're just out of thought here. If you had any thoughts, if you had any last thoughts on what your advice would be to the incoming president, that would be somewhat realistic within our current politics, but would be a bold move that could move us to the horizon here.
Right. I wanted to go back to the way Jim framed it, actually, and say, don't assume away a Trump candidacy, because that's where a non-trivial swath of the American people are, and you've got to start where people in the U.S. and other countries are, and not where you wish they were. Which also takes me to Chris, and so you identify that one of your big jobs as president is to use the bully pulpit to shift the balance between fear and optimism with which Americans look at the rest of the world. So that's shift number one. Shift number two is that you reprioritize the instruments of American diplomacy, formal and informal. What you don't do is go and say, oh, I'm going to just right off the top of the bat knock 10% off the Pentagon and hand it to the State Department, because great powers, big organizations are like aircraft carriers, they turn slowly. So you don't, and I think in retrospect, maybe this is something that Obama got wrong in the Middle East, that he actually moved a little faster toward a vision where the U.S. is not as engaged than the market was really ready to bear. So your transition is going to be frustrating and gradual. It's not going to be the kind of thing that makes sort of good steps on a podcast. But you're aiming to, and frankly, you're also aiming to rejuvenate the undercore of how it's possible for people to make a good living and feel confident about their society here in the U.S. And you're also thinking about how that applies in troubled societies in the rest of the world, because that's going to those are the tools that are going to give you the ways to get at problems non-militarily in the longest term. So that's, again, I know those aren't sort of sexy, exciting presidential platform things, but if you diagnose the problem the way we've been diagnosing it in this conversation, those are things that would make a difference. Oh, and one last thing, which I always say on these, but I, as you can tell from doing the math, if I graduated from college in 1989, I'm 47 years old. The national security, Peter knows where I'm going with this. Whether you are a neocon, a liberal interventionalist, a realist, a progressive, a paleoconservative, everyone in the national security establishment, we are too old and too white a community that goes for the advocacy community too. And if you want our national security policy to look more like these ways that the world has changed dramatically in the last 20 years, you're going to have more people who came of age in the last 20 years thinking and discussing and pushing us on it.
Totally agree, and a younger generation too. We've done a lot with. We had a fantastic panel on the next millennial generation's foreign policy, which actually is quite different than anybody else, and I think it's going to make a big difference in this country. So we're coming to the end here of not just this roundtable, but the whole series. So I'm going to give everyone just kind of a last thoughts on. I mean, it seemed I was going to say how optimistic or how pessimistic you are going forward, but I would actually put it to you is if we had to think out 30 years, which is enough time to get beyond the Trump era and other things that we might have to go through here, how positive are you or how negative are you about what kind of world we'll be living in? And just give one or two thoughts on why. We just have a minute each or so, and then we'll sign off. Jim, how about you? Where would you start?
So the way I'll begin here is to think back 30 years from back to 1985, 30 years ago, and whether people could have imagined then as many things that actually have gone right in that time. The Soviet Union is no longer around. The Atlantic actually read an article by John Lewis Gaddis around that time of imagining what would happen after the Cold War. And it still seems sort of fantastical to think there'd be no Soviet Union. So that has happened. We had the relatively peaceful rise of China. We've had this decline in conflict around the world. So I think it would be, we have this asymmetric hope profile where we will hope that these continuations of damping down the violence and sort of knitting up the human fabric continues, but we have to allow for the possibility of these various things that might go wrong. So I think that there's reason to think the next 30 years can be as basically progressive as the last 30 have been.
Hope you're right. Chris, your thoughts? Chris, are you there?
Oh, yeah, okay, sorry. I basically agree. I think that I'm optimistic when it comes to the structure of the world. I think we're moving in a positive direction, and there are a lot of things that will be hard to reverse, a lot of trends that will be hard to reverse. I'm pessimistic about individual decisions that countries make. We can make blunders along the way. The world's getting more peaceful, but we still attacked Iraq for some reason. And so I'm pessimistic about about little decisions that countries make along the way, but I think we're still moving in a positive direction. I think 30 years from now, we'll be talking about how ISIS will be a trivial pursuit question. I think they'll be long gone. There'll still be fundamentalists around. There always are. There'll still be terrorism. There always is. But I think overall, the world is not going to look too much different than it does now. And to the extent that it's different, it'll be better. The people will be living a little bit longer. There'll be less people in poverty. And there will be overall low levels of conflict. And there'll still, however, be people scared to death. The United States will still be worried about the next threats that we have. That's for sure. Now, hopefully, we won't do anything stupid in the meantime to make it worse.
Chris, thanks for those, as always, somewhat humorous thoughts, but well said. Heather, last thoughts?
I'm optimistic that in 30 years there will be places in the world that will be driving forward in the progressive way that Jim described. I'm worried about whether the U.S. will be one of those places or not.
Wow, okay. And that's your final word? Okay, let's go to Joe. That's an intriguing one for another roundtable. We'll get to the bottom of that one. Joe, your thoughts?
There's over 6 billion, almost 7 billion people in the world. There are going to be terrible things that continue to happen in the world, but I am optimistic that the next 30 years are going to be better than the past 30 years. And the past 30 years weren't too bad. The world is healthier, richer, and safer than it ever has been. We have challenges, we have tragedies that we're going to have to confront, but the biggest obstacle that we have to solving those is actually the partisan divide that is paralyzing our government. If we can just fix that, I think U.S. is in an excellent position to lead the rest of the world to overcoming some of these threats and challenges we face.
Wonderful way to wrap it. I'll tell you what, this has been a fantastic, really, and I'm not just saying this to you guys, this has been really one of the best roundtables we've had. It's perfectly timed to the end of the whole series. It's been a terrific series as well. Thank you so much for being here. It's really been helpful, and it's really made me think differently about what's ahead. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.